At 02:30 hours on the morning of October 25, 1944, Commander Richard O'Kane stood on the bridge of USS Tang, watching two torpedoes streak through the dark water of the Formosa Strait. One torpedo ran straight and true toward a damaged Japanese cargo ship. The other torpedo curved left. Its gyroscope had failed. The torpedo was running in a circle. It was coming back toward Tang. O'Kane was 33 years old. Naval Academy graduate class of 1934, 11 months commanding Tang. In those 11 months, across 4 completed war patrols, his submarine had sunk more Japanese ships than any boat in the Pacific Fleet. The Navy's leadership had called submarines a waste of resources before the war. The surface admirals called them sewer pipes. Admiral William Leahy, who would become Chief of Staff to President Roosevelt, had declared in 1937 that submarines were obsolete weapons with no role in modern naval warfare. Admiral Harry Yarnell stated that submarines would be useful only for reconnaissance and coastal defense. They lacked the range, speed, and firepower to operate effectively in the vast Pacific. When O'Kane had graduated from submarine school at New London in 1938, his classmates wondered why any officer would volunteer for a weapon the Navy did not believe in. The submarine service was where careers went to die. Officers who wanted to make admiral-commanded battleships or carriers. Officers who wanted combat glory served on destroyers or cruisers. Officers who could not get better assignments ended up on submarines. O'Kane explained it was not about belief, it was about capability. His classmates wanted to know what capability a submarine had that a battleship or carrier did not. O'Kane said submarines could approach unseen, strike without warning, and disappear before the enemy could respond. A battleship announced its presence from 20 miles away. A carrier needed clear weather and daylight to operate effectively. A submarine could hunt day or night, in any weather, in any sea state. The surface admirals disagreed. They pointed to World War I, where German U-boats had sunk merchant ships, but had not changed the strategic balance. The Allies had defeated Germany despite losing millions of tons of shipping to submarines. Convoys and escorts had proven effective against submarine attacks. Sonar technology had made submarines vulnerable to detection and destruction. Modern naval warfare would be decided by surface engagements and carrier battles, not by underwater raiders sneaking around in the dark. The Navy had built submarines anyway, but they had built them wrong. American submarine doctrine in 1941 emphasized scouting for the fleet, not independent operations against enemy commerce. Submarines would locate enemy warships and report their positions. They would screen for enemy submarines. They would conduct reconnaissance of enemy ports and bases. Sinking merchant ships was considered ungentlemanly warfare, suitable for Germans but beneath American honor. They had built the submarines as reconnaissance platforms. The Navy had 111 submarines by December of 1941. In the Pacific, 55 fleet submarines and 18 older S-class boats were available for combat operations. They represented less than 2% of the fleet's total strength. Every admiral who mattered had come up through battleships or carriers. Submarine officers were considered technical specialists, not warriors. They would scout for the real Navy, report enemy positions, maybe sink a cargo ship if they got lucky. No submarine in history had ever changed the outcome of a war. The United States had 284,427 men in the Navy when the war started. Approximately 16,000 would serve on submarines during the entire war. The submarine service could not compete with the prestige of surface ships. When a destroyer sank an enemy vessel, the entire crew watched it happen. When a carrier launched strikes, hundreds of men participated in the victory. Submarines operated alone, underwater, unseen, no witnesses, no glory, no recognition. O'Kane had requested submarine duty anyway. He believed the next war would be won by stealth and surprise, not by brute force. The surface admirals disagreed. The Mark 14 torpedo carried by every American submarine had been designed in 1931. It weighed 3,280 pounds. It carried a 663-pound warhead. It could travel 4,600 yards at 46 knots. On paper, it was the most sophisticated torpedo in any navy. In reality, it was the worst weapon system deployed by any major power in World War II. The Mark 14 had 4 fatal defects. First, it ran 10 feet deeper than set. Second, its magnetic exploder fired prematurely, or not at all. Third, its contact exploder crumpled on impact instead of detonating. Fourth, its gyroscope could fail, causing the torpedo to run in a circle and return toward the firing submarine. These defects were not discovered during peacetime testing because the Bureau of Ordnance had refused to conduct live-fire tests with actual warheads. Torpedoes cost $10,000 each in 1930 Depression-era dollars. That was more than twice the annual salary of a Navy captain. The Bureau considered it wasteful to blow up expensive torpedoes during testing. They tested with dummy warheads that could be recovered from the ocean floor, refurbished, and used again. The dummy warheads had different weight distribution than live warheads. The balance was wrong. The center of gravity was wrong. The hydrodynamics were wrong. But the Bureau insisted the tests were adequate. They had fired thousands of practice torpedoes over 10 years. The Mark 14 worked perfectly in tests. Any problems in combat must be the fault of submarine commanders who did not know how to use their weapons properly. The Bureau had another reason to avoid live fire testing. If live tests revealed problems with the Mark 14, the Bureau would have to admit they had spent millions of dollars developing a defective weapon. Careers would be ruined. Reputations would be destroyed. Congressional investigations would follow. It was easier to declare the weapon perfect and blame any failures on incompetent submariners. O'Kane learned the hard way on December 7, 1941. He was executive officer aboard USS Argonaut on patrol near Midway Island. That evening, Argonaut surfaced and heard gunfire. Japanese destroyers were shelling Midway Island. The next day, O'Kane received orders transferring him to a new submarine being commissioned, USS Wahoo, under Lieutenant Commander Marvin Kennedy. When Dudley Morton took command of Wahoo in early 1943, O'Kane served as his executive officer through 5 war patrols. Wahoo became legendary. Morton and O'Kane developed aggressive tactics that other submarine commanders studied and copied. Morton commanded from the conning tower, where he could see through the periscope and make tactical decisions instantly. O'Kane ran the approach from the control room, managing depth, speed, and course. They communicated constantly, adjusting tactics in real time as situations developed. Morton believed submarines should hunt like wolves, not hide like rabbits. He attacked on the surface whenever possible, using Wahoo's superior speed and radar to close on targets. He closed to point-blank range, often less than 800 yards, where even defective torpedoes had a better chance of working. He pursued crippled ships until they sank, firing torpedo after torpedo until the target went under. Other submarine commanders considered Morton reckless. They predicted Wahoo would be sunk within 6 months. Morton considered them cowards. He predicted cautious submarines would return to port with full torpedo loads and empty war patrol reports. Morton was right. Wahoo sank 20 ships in 6 patrols. But even Wahoo suffered from torpedo failures. During Wahoo's 6th patrol in August of 1943, 10 torpedoes definitely broached, had erratic runs, or were duds. Morton filed detailed reports describing the failures. The Bureau of Ordnance blamed the submarine commanders. They said the failures were caused by poor shooting, incorrect depth settings, or faulty maintenance. They refused to admit the torpedo design was flawed. Across the Pacific, every American submarine commander was reporting identical problems. Torpedoes ran too deep. Torpedoes exploded prematurely. Torpedoes hit the target and failed to detonate. Torpedoes ran in circles and threatened to sink their own submarines. The Bureau of Ordnance ignored every report. Submarine officers began deactivating the magnetic exploder without authorization. They could not fix the depth problem or the contact exploder problem or the gyroscope problem, but they could eliminate the magnetic exploder that was causing premature detonations. The unauthorized modifications were a court-martial offense. Officers did it anyway. If you want to see how O'Kane and the submarine force overcame defective weapons, a hostile bureaucracy, and the Navy's institutional contempt to sink 30% of Japan's fleet, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories like this, and please subscribe if you haven't already. Back to O'Kane. By March of 1943, 15 months into the war, American submarines had sunk fewer than 150 Japanese ships. The entire submarine force of 111 boats was achieving what 3 aircraft carriers could accomplish in a month. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, was losing patience. He had fought against the submarine advocates before the war. Now the submarines were proving him right. They were expensive, ineffective, and unable to project power. King ordered a review of submarine operations. The review confirmed what submarine commanders had been reporting since Pearl Harbor. The Mark 14 torpedo was defective. The Bureau of Ordnance finally agreed to conduct live-fire tests in August of 1942. They fired torpedoes at underwater nets in Hawaii. Every torpedo ran exactly 10 feet deeper than set. The depth control mechanism was miscalibrated. It had been miscalibrated since 1931. The Bureau of Ordnance issued new depth settings. Submarine commanders were instructed to set their torpedoes 10 feet shallower than the target's draft. This fixed the depth problem. The magnetic exploder was deactivated fleet-wide on June 24, 1943, by order of Admiral Nimitz. Commanders in the Southwest Pacific, under Admiral Christie, resisted until December of 1943. This fixed the premature detonation problem. The contact exploder remained defective. It required a direct perpendicular hit to function. Any oblique angle caused the firing pin to crumple instead of striking the primer. Submarine commanders discovered the fix through combat experience. USS Tainosa attacked the Japanese tanker Tonan Maru No. 3 on July 24, 1943. Commander Lawrence Daspit fired 15 torpedoes. 4 hit and exploded. 9 hit at perfect 90-degree angles and failed to detonate. Every dud struck at the ideal angle with perfect technique. The problem was not the shooting. The problem was the torpedo. Daspit saved his last torpedo and brought it back to Pearl Harbor for examination. Engineers discovered the contact exploder's firing pin was too weak. They redesigned it with a heavier, stiffer pin. The first corrected torpedoes shipped to the fleet on September 30th, 1943 aboard USS Barb. By late September of 1943, 21 months after Pearl Harbor, American submarines finally had a functional torpedo. O'Kane took command of USS Tang in October of 1943. Tang was a Balao-class submarine, 311 feet 6 inches long, 27 feet 2 inches in beam, displacing 2,424 tons submerged. She carried 24 torpedoes, 1 5-inch deck gun, and a crew of 87 men for her final patrol. Tang could dive to 400 feet, deeper than any previous American submarine. This depth capability was critical for survival. Japanese depth charges were set to explode at specific depths. Most escorts set depth charges for 150 to 200 feet, assuming submarines could not dive deeper. Tang could go twice that deep. When depth charges exploded at 200 feet, Tang would be at 400 feet, far enough away that the pressure waves were survivable. But 400 feet created its own challenges. The water pressure at that depth was 180 pounds per square inch, 12 times normal atmospheric pressure. Tang's pressure hull was designed to withstand that pressure, but it groaned and creaked under the strain. Rivets popped, seals leaked. Men could hear the hull flexing as pressure increased. It sounded like the submarine was being crushed. New crew members panicked the first time they heard it. Experienced crew members knew it was normal, but it never stopped being frightening. Life aboard Tang during war patrols was uncomfortable and dangerous even without enemy contact. 87 men lived in a space designed for 66. Men hot-bunked, sleeping in the same bunk in shifts. The submarine was never quiet. Machinery ran constantly. Diesel engines when surfaced, electric motors when submerged, pumps, fans, air compressors, the air conditioning system that removed carbon dioxide and added oxygen. All of it made noise. Sleep was difficult. The crew worked 6-hour watch cycles. 6 hours on watch, 6 hours off watch, but the 6 hours off included time for eating, maintenance, and personal hygiene. Actual sleep time was 4 hours if you were lucky. Showers were limited to once per week, 30 seconds of water. Fresh water was precious. The submarine carried only enough for drinking, cooking, and essential hygiene. Everything else used seawater. Food was good for the first week of patrol, while fresh provisions lasted. Eggs, milk, bread, fresh vegetables. Then it was canned food for the next 6 weeks. Powdered eggs, canned milk, canned vegetables, canned meat. The cooks did their best, but canned food tastes like canned food, no matter how you prepare it. The submarine carried 60 days of food. Patrols typically lasted 40 to 50 days, including transit time to and from the patrol area. That left a small margin for extended operations or delayed returns. The crew was divided into departments. The engineering department ran the engines and motors. The torpedo department maintained weapons and handled loading. The deck department managed the submarine's operations, navigation, and watch-standing. The radio and radar operators were specialists who reported directly to the captain. Every man had to qualify in submarines, learning every system aboard. In an emergency, any crew member might need to operate equipment outside his specialty. Cross-training was mandatory. Tang's crew was exceptionally well-trained. O'Kane drilled them constantly. Emergency procedures, damage control, firefighting, flooding response, torpedo loading, battery charging, navigation. Every task had to be performed faster and better than any other submarine in the fleet. The crew grumbled about the constant drilling. Then they went into combat and understood why. Their training kept them alive. Every American submarine had better sonar than Japanese destroyers. Every American submarine had better radar than Japanese cruisers. Every American submarine had better fire control computers than any surface ship in the Japanese Navy. These advantages had been meaningless when the torpedoes did not work. Now, they mattered. Tang's first war patrol began in January of 1944. O'Kane's orders were to patrol the waters between Japan and the Philippines. He was hunting Japanese cargo ships, tankers, and transports. The ships carried oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, rice from Indochina, iron from China, and coal from Manchuria. Japan's entire war machine depended on ships carrying raw materials from conquered territories to the home islands. Japan started the war with 6 million tons of merchant shipping. The fleet consisted of approximately 2,300 vessels, ranging from small coastal freighters of a few hundred tons to massive tankers of 10,000 tons or more. The fleet included specialized ships for different cargoes. Tankers carried oil and petroleum products. Their hulls were divided into compartments that could carry different grades of crude oil, refined gasoline, diesel fuel, or heavy bunker oil. Ore carriers transported iron ore, coal, and other minerals. Their holds were designed for dense, heavy cargo. Standard cargo ships carried everything else: rice, rubber, timber, manufactured goods, ammunition, military equipment. Transport ships carried troops. Some were converted passenger liners with proper berthing. Others were cargo ships with troops packed into holds designed for freight. The Japanese merchant fleet operated on predictable routes. Tankers ran from the Dutch East Indies through the South China Sea to Japan. Ore carriers ran from Malaya and the Philippines. Rice ships ran from Indochina and Formosa. Every route passed through waters where American submarines could operate. American submarine doctrine changed drastically after Pearl Harbor. Pre-war plans called for submarines to attack enemy warships. Sinking battleships and carriers would cripple Japan's offensive capability. But warships were hard to find and harder to sink. They were fast, maneuverable, and heavily escorted. They could fight back. A submarine that attacked a warship faced immediate counterattack from escorts. Merchant ships were different. They were slow, traveling at 8 to 12 knots. They were predictable, following established routes. They could not fight back effectively. Most merchant ships had no armament. Some carried a single deck gun or anti-aircraft machine guns. But these were useless against a submarine attack. And merchant ships were everywhere. For every Japanese warship, there were hundreds of merchant ships. American submarine commanders realized they could sink more tonnage by hunting merchants than by hunting warships. Admiral Charles Lockwood, Commander Submarines Pacific Fleet, authorized unrestricted submarine warfare against Japanese shipping in December 1941. Any Japanese-flagged vessel was a legitimate target. passenger ships, hospital ships clearly marked, and neutral shipping were off-limits. Everything else could be sunk on sight. This was controversial. International law required submarines to surface, stop merchant ships, allow crews to abandon ship, and only then sink the vessel. But Japan had declared it would execute captured submariners as war criminals. Japanese ships refused to stop when challenged. Japanese captains radioed submarine positions to nearby patrol aircraft. Under these conditions, American submarines could not follow peacetime prize rules. They attacked, submerged, without warning, and disappeared before anyone could respond. The Japanese called this barbaric. The Americans called it war. During Tang's first patrol, O'Kane sank 5 Japanese ships in 17 days. Total tonnage, 13,000 tons. He returned to Pearl Harbor with 0 torpedoes remaining and 17 Japanese sailors he had pulled from the water after their ship sank. The prisoners were valuable intelligence assets. They provided detailed information about Japanese convoy routes, escort tactics, and radar capabilities. O'Kane's second patrol began in April of 1944. He sank 4 ships, third patrol in June, 6 ships, fourth patrol in August, 10 ships. By September of 1944, Tang had sunk approximately 25 Japanese ships in 4 patrols. O'Kane had become the most successful submarine commander in the Navy. His tactics were studied at submarine school. His patrol reports were distributed to every boat in the Pacific. Other commanders tried to replicate his methods, but few achieved comparable results. O'Kane's advantage was not luck. It was not superior equipment. Every submarine in the Pacific had the same torpedoes, the same sonar, the same radar. O'Kane's advantage was aggression combined with technical mastery. Most submarine commanders conducted 1 attack per patrol, maybe 2. They would locate a target, maneuver into position, fire torpedoes from maximum range of 4,000 yards or more, and immediately dive deep to evade escorts. This was safe. This was doctrine. This also meant torpedoes had longer travel time, giving targets more opportunity to maneuver. Long-range shots required perfect calculations of target speed, course, and range. Any error meant a miss. O'Kane conducted multiple attacks per patrol, sometimes 4 or 5 engagements in a single week. He closed to minimum range before firing, often less than 1,000 yards, sometimes as close as 800 yards. At that range, torpedoes reached the target in less than 2 minutes. Targets had no time to maneuver. Torpedoes running slightly off course still hit. Even if escorts detected Tang, they could not react quickly enough to prevent the attack. O'Kane attacked at night on the surface whenever possible. Tang's low profile made her nearly invisible in darkness. Her radar could detect targets at 20,000 yards, far beyond visual range. Japanese escorts had primitive radar. They relied on visual spotting and sonar, but sonar could not detect a submarine on the surface. Tang could approach within 1,000 yards of a convoy, fire torpedoes, and disappear into the darkness before Japanese escorts knew where the attack had come from. O'Kane pursued damaged ships until they sank. Most commanders fired a spread of torpedoes, hoped for hits, and then cleared the area. O'Kane stayed and watched. If a ship was damaged but still afloat, he maneuvered for another shot. He fired torpedoes until ships went under, or until Tang had no torpedoes remaining. Japanese escorts expected submarines to fire and run. They searched in the wrong places because they could not believe any submarine commander would be aggressive enough to remain in the attack area. O'Kane also trained his crew to operate faster than any other submarine in the fleet. The Navy's peacetime doctrine for submarines emphasized caution, stealth, and survival. Torpedo reload time was 15 minutes. Fire control solutions took 5 minutes. Dive time from surface to periscope depth was 2 minutes. O'Kane's crew cut those times in half. His crew learned to reload torpedoes in 6 to 8 minutes. His torpedo officer, Lieutenant Junior Grade Frank Springer, could calculate firing solutions faster than the mechanical torpedo data computer. Springer had an intuitive grasp of geometry and relative motion. He could look at a target's bearing rate and know instantly what course and speed to set. His solutions were more accurate than the computer's calculations. O'Kane trusted Springer completely. The radar operator, Radioman First Class Floyd Cavalli, could identify ship types by their radar signature alone. A tanker's superstructure produced a different radar return than a cargo ship. A destroyer's profile looked different from a transport. Cavalli could tell O'Kane what type of ships were in a convoy before anyone could see them through a periscope. This allowed Tang to prioritize targets. Tankers carried more valuable cargo than cargo ships. Transports packed with troops were priority targets. Cavalli's skill gave Tang a tactical advantage no other submarine possessed. Tang's fifth and final patrol began on September 24, 1944. O'Kane's orders were to interdict Japanese shipping in the Formosa Strait and the waters between Formosa and the China coast. Intelligence indicated heavy traffic as the Japanese were reinforcing their garrison in the Philippines before the expected American invasion. General Douglas MacArthur was planning to return to the Philippines in October. The Japanese knew it. They were rushing troops, equipment, and supplies to defend the islands. Every transport that reached the Philippines meant more American casualties when the invasion began. Every tanker that delivered fuel meant more Japanese aircraft in the sky. Every cargo ship that arrived meant more ammunition for Japanese defenders. Tang's mission was to stop those ships. Tang transited through the Luzon Strait and entered her patrol area on October 10th. The Formosa Strait was one of the most dangerous submarine operating areas in the Pacific. The strait was only 100 miles wide at its narrowest point. Shallow water restricted diving depth. Japanese air bases on Formosa and the Chinese mainland could scramble aircraft within minutes of a submarine sighting. Japanese patrol boats operated constantly. The confined waters meant escorts could search more effectively. A submarine detected in the Formosa Strait had limited room to maneuver, but the confined waters also meant every Japanese ship heading for the Philippines had to pass through the strait. It was a choke point. Submarines operating there could intercept nearly all traffic heading south. Over the next 2 weeks, Tang stalked Japanese convoys through these dangerous waters. O'Kane employed the aggressive tactics he had perfected over 4 previous patrols. Surface attacks at night when Tang's radar gave her an overwhelming advantage. Close-range firing that gave targets no time to maneuver and escorts no time to react. Relentless pursuit of damaged ships, firing torpedo after torpedo until they sank. Each engagement was carefully planned and ruthlessly executed. O'Kane would detect a convoy on radar at extreme range. He would plot the convoy's course and speed. He would calculate an intercept course that positioned Tang ahead of the convoy, between the convoy and its destination. Then he would wait on the surface, engines quiet, radar watching, until the convoy came within range. Tang sank cargo ships carrying war materials to the Philippines. She sank tankers, hauling fuel oil from the Dutch East Indies. She sank transports packed with troops and equipment. Each sinking meant fewer supplies for Japanese forces defending the Philippines. Each sinking meant fewer American casualties when MacArthur's forces landed. The Japanese escorts hunted Tang with depth charges and sonar after each attack. They dropped patterns of depth charges based on where they thought a submarine might be hiding. Sometimes they guessed right, and charges exploded close enough to shake Tang violently. Light bulbs shattered, equipment broke loose, men were thrown against bulkheads, but Tang always escaped. O'Kane would dive deep, run silent, and wait for the escorts to give up. The crew would sit in darkness, barely breathing, listening to the escort's sonar pinging through the water. Ping, ping, ping. Each ping meant the escorts were still searching. Then the pings would fade. The escorts would give up and rejoin their convoy. O'Kane would wait another 30 minutes to be certain, then surface and resume hunting. By October 24th, Tang had fired most of her torpedoes. She had achieved exceptional results. Modern research credits Tang with 13 ships sunk during this patrol, though the precise number and timing of individual attacks remain subjects of historical debate. O'Kane continued hunting even as his torpedo supply dwindled. On the night of October 24th, 1944, Tang's radar detected a Japanese convoy north of Turnabout Island in the Formosa Strait. O'Kane had only a few torpedoes remaining. He positioned Tang for what would be her final attack. The convoy consisted of several cargo ships and escorts, traveling at slow speed through calm seas. Visibility was good. O'Kane could see the silhouettes of the cargo ships against the night sky. Tang maneuvered into attack position. The crew had executed this maneuver dozens of times. They knew their roles. They trusted their commander. They had survived every previous engagement. At approximately 2300 hours, Tang began her attack run. O'Kane fired multiple torpedoes at the convoy. The torpedoes struck home. Cargo ships exploded and began sinking. Japanese escorts turned toward Tang's position, but Tang had already moved. O'Kane maneuvered to finish off damaged ships with his remaining torpedoes. At 0230 hours on October 25th, Tang fired her last 2 torpedoes at a damaged cargo ship. One torpedo ran straight toward the target. The other torpedo malfunctioned immediately after leaving the tube. Its gyroscope failed. The torpedo curved left in a tight circle. It was running back toward Tang. O'Kane saw the torpedo's phosphorescent wake in the dark water. The wake curved in a perfect arc. It was coming straight at Tang's stern. O'Kane shouted orders: hard right rudder, ahead flank. Tang's engines roared to full power. The submarine began to turn. But Tang was a 311-foot submarine displacing 2,400 tons. She could not turn fast enough. The torpedo hit Tang's stern at 0230 hours. The explosion destroyed the maneuvering room and the after-torpedo room. Men died instantly in the blast. The stern flooded immediately. Tang's stern sank. The bow rose out of the water at a steep angle. O'Kane and 8 other men were on the bridge when the torpedo hit. The impact and the sudden angle threw them into the water. Below decks, 78 men were trapped in the flooding submarine. Tang sank stern, first in 180 feet of water north of Turnabout Island in the Formosa Strait. The submarine settled on the bottom. In the forward torpedo room, 9 men prepared to escape using Momsen lungs, emergency breathing devices designed for submarine escapes. The Momsen lung was a rubber bag connected to a breathing tube. It provided oxygen during ascent from a sunken submarine, but 180 feet was deeper than most men had ever attempted an escape. The water pressure at that depth was crushing. The ascent would take several minutes. Men would have to equalize pressure carefully to avoid the bends. If they ascended too quickly, nitrogen bubbles in their blood would kill them. If they ascended too slowly, they would run out of air. The 9 men entered the escape trunk. They flooded the compartment. The pressure equalized. They opened the outer hatch. One by one, they swam toward the surface 180 feet above. The ascent took forever. The water was black. The men could not see the surface. They could only swim upward and hope. 5 men survived the ascent. 4 men, including O'Kane, survived in the water long enough to be picked up by a Japanese escort vessel. The Japanese did not immediately realize they had captured Americans. In the dark, they assumed the survivors were Japanese sailors from the sunken cargo ships. When dawn came and the Japanese realized they had captured enemy submariners, the treatment became harsh. O'Kane and the other 3 survivors spent the rest of the war as prisoners in Japanese camps. The conditions were brutal from the start. The Japanese escort that picked them from the water initially treated them as enemy combatants who had just sunk multiple Japanese ships and killed Japanese sailors. The guards beat them. They denied them food and water for days. They kept them in cramped spaces, barely large enough to stand. When the survivors reached Japan, they were sent to Ofuna Interrogation Center near Yokohama. Ofuna was not registered with the International Red Cross. The Geneva Convention did not apply there. Guards told prisoners they could be executed at any time without anyone knowing. Interrogators wanted information about American submarines. What type of sonar did they use? What type of radar? What were their operating procedures? What were their patrol areas? O'Kane refused to answer. The interrogators beat him. They denied him food. They kept him in solitary confinement in a cell too small to lie down in. He still refused. The other Tang survivors refused as well. After weeks at Ofuna, O'Kane and his men were transferred to Omori camp in Tokyo Bay. Omori held Allied prisoners of war from multiple services. The camp was overcrowded, filthy, and disease-ridden. Food consisted of small portions of rice, sometimes with vegetables, rarely with protein. A typical daily ration was 800 calories. That was barely enough to survive, not enough to maintain health. Men lost weight rapidly, muscles atrophied, teeth fell out from scurvy, disease spread constantly, dysentery, beriberi, pneumonia, tuberculosis. The camp had no medical supplies. Sick men either recovered on their own or died. Guards were abusive without cause or warning. They would beat prisoners for bowing incorrectly, for not bowing quickly enough, for looking at a guard, for not looking at a guard. The rules changed daily. What was permitted one day was forbidden the next. Guards enforced arbitrary rules with fists and clubs. O'Kane watched one of his men, motor machinist's mate first class Jesse Da Silva, die from complications of malnutrition and abuse. Da Silva had survived Tang's sinking. He had survived the escape from 180 feet depth. He had survived the initial captivity. But he could not survive the slow starvation and disease of Amori. O'Kane blamed himself. He was the captain. His men were his responsibility. He had led them into combat and they had followed. Now one was dead, and O'Kane could do nothing to save him. The other two Tang survivors, Lieutenant Junior Grade Lawrence Savadkin and Torpedoman's mate second class Floyd Cavalli, survived the captivity. So did O'Kane. But survival came at a cost measured in pounds of lost body weight and permanent damage to health. When American forces liberated Amori in late August of 1945, O'Kane weighed 88 pounds. He could barely walk. His body was ravaged by malnutrition and disease. But he was alive. Tang's 5th Patrol had brought her total sinkings to 33 ships, totaling 116,454 tons. That remained the record for most tonnage sunk by a single American submarine in World War II. No other submarine came close. O'Kane received the Medal of Honor on March 27, 1946, from President Harry Truman for his actions during Tang's final patrol. The citation described his aggressive tactics, his tactical brilliance, and his willingness to press attacks despite extreme danger. After the war, O'Kane continued serving in the Navy. He commanded Submarine Division 32. He worked in submarine development, helping design the next generation of submarines. He trained new commanders, passing on the lessons he had learned the hard way in combat. He retired as captain in July of 1957, with advancement to Rear Admiral on the retired list. During the war, American submarines comprised less than 2% of the Navy, but accounted for 30% of all Japanese ships sunk. They sank 1,113 Japanese merchant ships, totaling 4.78 million tons, according to the Joint Army-Navy Assessment Committee. They sank 201 Japanese warships, including 8 aircraft carriers, 1 battleship, and 11 cruisers. The submarine force suffered the highest casualty rate of any American service. 52 submarines were lost during the war. 3,505 men died. That was 22% of all submariners who served. Every submarine that went on patrol knew it might not return. Every man who climbed through the hatch knew he might never climb back out, but their impact was disproportionate to their numbers. Japan entered the war dependent on imported resources. The home islands had no oil except tiny fields producing less than 10% of requirements. Iron ore had to be imported from Malaya and the Philippines. Coal came from Manchuria and China. Rubber came from the Dutch East Indies. Rice came from Indochina, Formosa, and Korea. Even basic food supplies had to be imported to feed the Japanese population. Every resource needed to sustain the war effort came by ship from conquered territories thousands of miles away. The Japanese economy was designed around this reality. Factories processed raw materials shipped from the empire. Oil refineries processed crude oil shipped from the Dutch East Indies. Steel mills processed iron ore shipped from Malaya. The entire system depended on ships making regular runs between the resource areas and the home islands. American submarines cut those supply lines methodically and ruthlessly. They did not need to sink every ship. They only needed to sink enough ships to reduce imports below the minimum needed to sustain the war economy. For Japan, that minimum was approximately 5 million tons of shipping capacity operating at high efficiency. Sink more than half that capacity, and the Japanese economy would begin to collapse. By 1944, American submarines were sinking Japanese ships faster than Japanese shipyards could replace them. Japan started the war with 6 million tons of merchant shipping. By mid-1944, despite building new ships constantly, Japan had less than 4 million tons remaining. By mid-1945, Japan had less than 2 million tons. The effects cascaded through the Japanese economy. Oil imports collapsed first. In 1941, Japan imported 50 million barrels of oil. In 1944, they imported less than 10 million barrels. In early 1945, oil imports ceased completely. Without oil, the Japanese Navy could not operate. The combined fleet, which had terrified the Pacific in 1941 and 1942, spent 1945 tied up in port because there was no fuel to operate. When the battleship Yamato sortied for her final mission in April of 1945, she carried just enough fuel for a one-way trip. There was no fuel to bring her back. Without oil, the Japanese Air Force was grounded. Pilots trained in 1944 and 1945 received minimal flight time because there was no aviation fuel for training. When they flew combat missions, they were so poorly trained that American pilots called them targets, not opponents. Without oil, Japanese factories could not produce weapons or ammunition. Factory output collapsed. In 1941, Japanese factories had produced 2,300 aircraft per month. By early 1945, production had dropped below 500 aircraft per month, despite desperate attempts to increase output. The problem was not factory capacity. The problem was no fuel to run the factories and no aluminum or steel to build aircraft, because the cargo ships carrying those materials had been sunk by American submarines. Food imports collapsed next. Japan imported 60% of its rice and nearly all its protein from the empire. As shipping tonnage declined, the military got priority for remaining capacity. Food imports were cut. By mid-1945, the average Japanese civilian was receiving 1,200 calories per day, barely enough to survive. Urban populations were starving. Rural populations had local rice production but no tools or fertilizer because those items came by ship from other parts of the empire. The Japanese government implemented rationing in 1942. By 1945, rations had been cut multiple times. The official ration provided subsistence, not nutrition. The black market flourished, but prices were beyond what most people could afford. If the war had continued into 1946, mass starvation would have occurred. American submarines had strangled Japan completely. The Strategic Bombing Survey conducted after the war concluded that the submarine blockade was the decisive factor in Japan's defeat. The survey's report on oil stated that the contribution of bombing against oil was negligible because the war had already been won by the blockade. Japanese oil imports tell the story. In 1944, Japan expected to import 28.5 million barrels of oil from the southern zone. They actually imported only 4.9 million barrels. That was an 82% shortfall. By April of 1945, oil imports ceased completely. Without oil, the Japanese Navy could not operate. Without oil, the Japanese Air Force was grounded. Without oil, Japanese factories could not produce weapons. Without oil, Japanese civilians froze in winter and starved year-round. The submarines did what the surface fleet could not do, and what strategic bombing could not accomplish. They isolated Japan from the resources needed to continue fighting. The weapon system the Navy had dismissed before the war became the decisive factor in Japan's defeat. The admirals who had called submarines sewer pipes never admitted they were wrong. They simply stopped talking about it. The official Navy histories written after the war described submarines as a critical component of the Pacific strategy. The pre-war skepticism was quietly forgotten. Submarine officers who had been considered technical specialists became heroes. Their patrol reports were studied at the Naval War College. Their tactics became doctrine for the next generation of submariners. The Mark 14 torpedo that had failed so catastrophically in the first 21 months of the war was praised in post-war assessments as a sophisticated weapon system that gave American submarines a decisive advantage once it was fixed. No one mentioned it had taken 21 months of combat losses and submarine commander initiative to fix problems that should have been discovered during peacetime testing. O'Kane wrote a book about his experiences in 1977. The book was titled Clear the Bridge, a reference to the command given before diving. It described Tang's war patrols in technical detail. The book became required reading at submarine school and remains in print today. O'Kane also worked with the Navy to develop improved submarine tactics for the Cold War. The aggressive approach he had pioneered against Japanese convoys was adapted for operations against Soviet shipping. The principles remained unchanged. Submarines still operated alone. They still attacked from concealment. They still required commanders willing to accept risk in pursuit of decisive results. O'Kane died on February 16, 1994, in Petaluma, California. He was 83 years old. By then, the submarine force he had helped create had evolved beyond recognition. Nuclear submarines could remain submerged for months. They could launch ballistic missiles capable of destroying entire cities. They carried firepower equal to entire World War II fleets. But the tactical principles remained unchanged. Aggression mattered more than caution. Initiative mattered more than doctrine. Results mattered more than survival. USS Tang was never salvaged. She remains at the bottom of the Formosa Strait, in 180 feet of water, at coordinates 25 degrees, 25 minutes 53 seconds north, 119 degrees, 56 minutes, 24 seconds east. Her exact condition is unknown. No expedition has successfully located and documented the wreck. The submarine that sank more Japanese tonnage than any other boat in the Pacific Fleet lies forgotten on the seafloor where she sank 79 years ago, but her legacy has not been forgotten. Every submarine commander in the United States Navy studies O'Kane's patrol reports. Every submarine officer learns the lessons Tang demonstrated through 4 successful patrols and one final mission that ended in tragedy. The lessons are simple but profound. Technology matters, but only if it works. The Mark 14 torpedo was sophisticated on paper but useless in combat until its defects were fixed. Bureaucracy can kill as surely as the enemy. The Bureau of Ordnance's refusal to conduct proper testing and its denial of field reports cost American submarines 21 months of reduced effectiveness and countless lost opportunities. Leadership matters more than numbers. 2% of the Navy sank 30% of Japan's fleet because submarine commanders like O'Kane refused to accept peacetime doctrine in wartime conditions. Aggression wins wars. Cautious submarines returned safely to port with full torpedo loads. Aggressive submarines like Tang returned with empty tubes and enemy ships on the bottom. Innovation comes from the bottom up. Submarine commanders deactivated the magnetic exploder without authorization because they knew it did not work. They modified tactics without permission because peacetime doctrine did not fit wartime reality. Sacrifice is the price of victory. 3,505 submariners died so that Japan's supply lines could be cut. They died in flooded compartments, in failed escapes, in prisoner of war camps. They died so that others could live and the war could be won. The 2% of the Navy that sank 30% of Japan's fleet proved something the admirals had refused to believe before the war. Individual ships commanded by exceptional officers could change the strategic balance of power. Submarines were not auxiliary vessels supporting the main fleet. They were independent weapons systems capable of decisive action. The sewer pipes had won the war. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We are rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about submariners who proved themselves with skill and courage. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you are watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, or Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You are not just a viewer, you are part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served on submarines. Just let us know you are here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Richard O'Kane and the men of USS Tang do not disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you are helping make that happen.